Well, welcome everybody. I am so excited to introduce you to another one of our survival contest judges. And today with us, one of our celebrity judges is Mr. Josh Flowers. And many of you may know Josh. He's become a great friend of Lightspeed, has been a Lightspeed wearer since he first started learning to fly. But he's famous in aviation really because of his YouTube channel, probably the most notable, although there's some other things that we'll learn about from him that he's involved in as well. But he started out as Mr. Aviation 101, but now the more modern thing is Aviation 101, and up to about 230,000 subscribers on YouTube, I believe, as of right now. So we're super excited to introduce you to him. He started flying as young as the FAA allows and has loved the sky ever since. In 2016, he became a CFI and he's used his platform to share his experiences and mistakes in real world flying. He's accumulated about 1,700 hours at this point, and all of which have delivered valuable lessons that he's been lucky enough to share with the world, one video at a time. And so Josh, welcome. It's great to have you.
I appreciate that. Glad to be here.
Yeah, well, thank you. Well, all of these introductory videos, we're hoping to make them, if we want to kind of bring you to life for some of the folks who haven't maybe had a chance to meet you in person.
Sure.
And we also are trying to just give little short snippets of educational topics as well. I think the reason that we're all doing this, the reason you signed up and the reason that we're doing the series of blog posts and the contest is because we are passionate about aviation and because the notion of what you do after you make a successful off-airport landing is probably a little bit of an underrepresented topic in general aviation. And so we can all use our collective platforms to bring a little bit more light to that. So with that, you're CFI, you've trained a lot of general aviation pilots. How do you kind of approach the topic of survival after the landing with your folks?
Well, it's definitely a topic that is not touched on enough, I don't think, just like you just said. And the way I normally bring it up is, okay, we think about, there's a good field to put it down, or here's a good, a highway in the middle of nowhere, whatever it may be. Okay, you get it on the ground, now what? And then usually that's when I start to see the light bulb start to flicker on with a student, and they start to say, well, oh, okay, yeah, that's true. What do you do after that? And what I've had to face myself a lot is flying over water. You can say all day long, okay, I'm going to put it down in the water here or there, and it'll be fine, and then I'll swim to shore. And what I'll bring up with people who make that argument, or if I made that argument early on, I would start to almost argue with myself about it and say, okay, but what if you broke your leg during impact and you cannot tread water, or what if this, what if that? There's all these what ifs. So I like to start, and that's usually a good conversation to have on the ground. That's where I like to start that conversation about post-crash or post-forced landing preparedness. And I just start to ask those questions about, okay, well, what if you get on the ground and the wing clipped a tree and the panel came down and, crushed your femur or something. And now, now you've got to crawl out of the plane. And what do you have in the plane that can immediately help that situation? How are you going to alleviate or mitigate your risks right there on the ground as soon as you get out of the plane? And then how are you going to get found? Or how are you going to start taking steps toward getting found? And with my preparedness and the way I teach it as well, I like to divide it up into handling the situation after the crash or after the forced landing. And then after it's handled and everything, the dust is kind of settled, how are you going to get found? Or how are you going to get help to you? How are you going to get to help? So I generally divide it up into those two topics, taking care of it right after the fact and then getting found. So it's kind of like short term and long term. And I try to carry the proper stuff with me in the aircraft, depending on the trip that I'm going on, what am I flying over, etc. And I try to talk about that as much as possible, especially on camera when the video is going out to a big audience, because that's a topic that's not really addressed very much.
So I know you haven't ever actually had a crash landing of your own, but have you maybe played through some of the scenarios, or how do you kind of get yourself sharp in case that were to ever happen?
Absolutely. I definitely play that scenario in my head a lot, and I've been very fortunate to not have had a forced landing yet. I'm under the impression that it is a hard yet. I feel like, the more experience you get, you'll have either a brush with it or something will happen at some point. My dad and I did recently have a partial power loss just after takeoff, but it was one of those situations where we had enough altitude to just immediately make a U-turn back to the airport. We didn't lose all the power. It was only some of it from the engine. all that kind of stuff. So we weren't in that type of situation, but when a situation like that or an experience like that really opens your eyes up to, wow, this engine can quit, or this motor can start losing RPM and a cylinder can go, or whatever the case may be. And we've done a lot of things over the years, personally, my dad and I, with the aircraft to kind of prepare ourselves with that. Most of the time when you have an engine failure, you have things that start to tell you that story before it actually happens. So you'll start to see a cylinder head temp getting weird, or some parameter gets out of whack or something like that. So we can generally catch an issue before it becomes a real issue. But when I'm flying over water or single engine at night, that's a big one. Or over mountains, whatever the case may be, I'm constantly thinking about, okay, if the engine quit right now, what's within my glide ring on ForeFlight or whatever I'm looking at? Where could I put it? And if I do put it down there, what are the risks? And what's that post-crash experience going to look like? Obviously, in our heads, we play the most favorable scenario where, oh, I greased it onto this grass field and the barbed wire fence stopped me, or whatever it may be. Most of the time, that's not the case. Even making a landing on water, especially in a fixed gear aircraft like the Skyhawk is, there's a big risk of flipping over when you hit the water. Even if you get super, super slow, there's still a pretty good risk of flipping over. And that's a big risk of injury and this and that. So I like to play those scenarios in my head as often as I can, especially, in fact, the passenger that was with us the other day, she was in the back of the 172 filming when we were doing these performance profiles for another company offshore out here in Florida. And she said every time I reached for an engine control, she was watching my eyes every time I would glance toward land. Every single time. I didn't catch it. I'm sure I'll catch it on camera, but it's one of those things that I try to keep in the back of my mind. And I think the more I share that on camera and point those types of things out and point those mentalities out in myself, at least, I hope that kind of rubs off on other people. And I'm certainly not perfect. Sometimes I rocket into a situation where I did not think of, what about this? What about that? But I think it's super important that we do that. So I absolutely play those scenarios in my head all the time.
That's fantastic. Yes. Well, you mentioned something that is a topic for all kinds of hangar conversation, and that is executing the 180 when you are shortly after takeoff. And so how did you, that's an instantaneous decision. You had partial power, it sounds like, maybe a certain amount of altitude. How did you go through the math? How did you know what to do and that you were going to ensure a successful outcome on that?
Absolutely. That was kind of an experience I didn't even talk about on social media when it happened or anything. And normally I post about a bunch of different flights, but we weren't rolling cameras. Nothing was recording. And it was just after it got dark, my dad and I took off to go on a training flight. And I was sitting in the right seat, and tower was about 15 minutes from closing. And we took off and we were climbing out. We got to 300 feet. And this is the only reason this was possible is because it was only a partial power loss. If we would have lost the entire power plant, we would have had to put it in a field straight ahead. There's no way we would have turned. But I started to hear the RPM drop, and we're only 300 feet climbing out in the 172. So the first thought through my head was, why is my dad reducing power? And I looked at his hand, because it was smooth. It was a smooth reduction of 100 or 200 RPM. Maybe not even that much. In my head, it sounded like a lot because I wasn't expecting it. And I looked at his hand, and his hand had not moved. It was still holding full throttle. And then we kind of looked at each other. And then before either of us could get a word out, the RPM came back up, and then it dropped again and began running rough. And at that point, I'm trying to remember exactly, because he had the flight controls, and we both had the same thought at the same time. And that's, we're turning back right now. We're not going to stay up here long enough to see if this is just water in the line. We're not going to stay up here long enough to figure it out. He immediately heeled it over into a left turn, about a 30-degree bank, and started turning back toward the airport. We're still climbing. We still have power. And I immediately reached for the push to talk and told tower we need an immediate landing. I didn't use the E word. I didn't declare an emergency because there was no time. But he heard the tone of my voice, and he recognized that something's going on. You're cleared to land runway 26, which was the opposite direction runway. And we just made a pretty steep turn. Once we had it made, we brought the power all the way back to idle. We were super high. And we just kept the turn coming around, lined up with the runway, full flaps, and put it down about halfway down the runway. And then it was fine. We tried to recreate the problem. We decaled the plane, had several pairs of eyes look at everything, not a thing wrong. And ever since then, I've put probably 20 hours on the plane. And we're pretty sure it was just contamination in the induction system that could not be detected by a sump or the gasculator. But that is definitely one of those situations where I started to think, what if we would have had to just nose it over and put it in one of these pitch black fields right in front of us? So that got me thinking about, single engine at night. Yeah,
Right.
And when I started flying, a lot of people, I would fly at night a lot because as a student pilot or a fresh private pilot, even instrument rated commercial pilot, I just did not think about the risks of single engine. I was putting a lot of trust into that one and only 4-cylinder engine up front.
Right. Yeah.
And
Yes.
and now after I've had that experience and just over the years heard many stories and talked to many friends who have had different experiences, I'm kind of starting to pick my battles in terms of flying at night, single engine, long cross countries. I try to do that in the daytime, super low IFR. I don't really mess with that in a single engine, things like that. So having those different experiences definitely makes you realize that, oh, okay, yeah, that engine can fail.
Right. Right. Yeah.
We
We
maintain it
train for this.
meticulously.
Right. And then like it actually does happen, right? And yeah. So anyways, well, that is awesome. I think everyone has learned a ton here just in this few minutes of talking to you. We're super excited also too that you're going to be one of the judges for the contest. Well, thank you. And if people wanted to learn a little bit more or see some of your videos and stuff, where can they go?
Absolutely. So if you go to aviation101.com, you'll always see right there on the homepage is my latest video that's been posted on YouTube. I try to post every other week. And outside of that, it's Aviation 101 Aviation 101 on YouTube, and then Aviation 101 on all the social medias, Instagram, Facebook, all of that.
Perfect. All right. Well, you're a great friend to the company. We appreciate everything you do. Thanks a lot, and safe journeys on your next adventures, and we'll talk to you soon.